The heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B swung open with an ominous creak that made 8-year-old Emma flinch. Her small hand gripped her mother's fingers so tightly that both their knuckles had turned white. The bailiff, a stern-looking man with gray hair and a crisp uniform, gestured for them to enter. Emma's sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floor as she took hesitant steps forward, each one feeling like she was walking toward the edge of a cliff. The courtroom was nothing like what she'd seen on television. It was enormous, intimidatingly so. The ceiling stretched up impossibly high, adorned with ornate moldings that seemed to press down on her like a giant's hands. Row after row of wooden benches filled with strangers stared at her with curious, expectant eyes. Some had notebooks. Others had cameras that they quickly tucked away when the bailiff shot them warning glances. Emma felt like a tiny ant in a world built for giants. Her mother, Maria, bent down and whispered encouragingly, "You can do this, me. Just tell them what you saw, the truth. That's all." But Emma's throat felt like someone had filled it with cotton. She nodded weakly, though her whole body screamed to run back through those heavy doors and never return. Judge sat elevated behind the bench, her black robes making her seem both authoritative and somehow kind. She had soft gray eyes that crinkled at the corners, eyes that had seen 15 years of testimony, lies, tears, and truth. When she looked at Emma, her expression softened immediately. She'd presided over countless cases, but child witnesses always affected her differently. They carried a vulnerability that made even the most hardened legal professional remember their humanity. "Good morning, Emma," Judge said gently, her voice echoing through the cavernous room despite her attempt at softness. "I know this seems scary, but everyone here is just going to listen to you. You're very brave for being here." Emma wanted to feel brave. She wanted to be the strong girl her mother always told her she was. But as she was led to the witness stand, a chair that sat elevated and exposed, spotlighted by the morning sun streaming through the tall windows, all she felt was terror. Pure, overwhelming terror that made her heart hammer against her like a trapped bird. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Jennifer, approached with a warm smile. She was a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor she reserved specifically for child witnesses. She'd spent the past week preparing Emma for this moment, practicing questions in the comfort of the Victim Services office, assuring her it would be okay. But now, standing in the actual courtroom with dozens of eyes boring into her, Emma felt all that preparation evaporate like morning dew. "Emma, can you state your full name for the record?" Ms. began with the simplest possible question. Emma's mouth opened. Nothing came out. Her lips moved soundlessly like a fish gasping for air. She tried again, still nothing. The words were trapped somewhere deep inside her chest, locked behind a door of fear that she couldn't open. Across the room, seated at the defense table, watched her struggle with an expression that was difficult to read. He was a large man in his mid-30s, wearing an ill-fitting suit that his public defender had probably insisted upon. His dark eyes remained fixed on Emma, and whether he intended it or not, his stare felt predatory. Emma had seen those eyes before, through a window on the worst night of her summer. Those were the eyes that haunted her nightmares. "It's okay, sweetheart. Take your time," Ms. encouraged, glancing worriedly at Judge. But time didn't help. Minutes ticked by, 5, then 10, then 15. Emma sat frozen, tears streaming silently down her cheeks, her small chest heaving with suppressed sobs. Her mother watched from the gallery, pressing a tissue against her own eyes, wanting desperately to run to her daughter but knowing she couldn't. The rules were clear. Emma had to do this alone. Judge intervened. "Let's take a different approach. Emma, would you like some water?" Emma nodded, and the bailiff brought her a plastic cup. She drank it in tiny, trembling sips, but it didn't wash away the fear. It didn't unlock her voice. Robert Hillman, the defense attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He was a career public defender who'd seen many difficult cases, but watching a child struggle like this stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. Still, his job was to defend his client, and part of him recognized that if Emma couldn't testify, the prosecution's case would crumble. The evidence against was largely circumstantial without her eyewitness account. Ms. tried again, this time with even simpler questions. "Emma, do you know why you're here today?" A small nod. "Can you speak your answer out loud for the court?" Emma's lips trembled. More tears fell, but still no sound emerged. She was drowning in her own silence, suffocating under the weight of all those staring eyes and the pressure of what she knew she had to say. Her hands gripped the armrests of the witness chair so tightly that her fingernails left small indentations in the wood. In the back corner of the courtroom, Dr. Sarah watched with professional concern. She was Emma's trauma therapist, a specialist in childhood PTSD who'd been working with the girl for 6 months since the incident. Doctor had warned everyone this might happen, that Emma suffered from trauma-induced selective mutism triggered by high-stress situations. In their private sessions, Emma could talk freely about what she'd witnessed. But here, in this pressure cooker of a courtroom, surrounded by strangers and forced to face her fears head-on, the child's defense mechanisms had completely shut down her ability to speak. 20 minutes had now passed. Judge was running out of patience, not with Emma but with the situation. She couldn't force a traumatized child to speak. That would be cruel and potentially. But without Emma's testimony, a dangerous criminal might walk free. The judge found herself caught between compassion and justice, two values that usually aligned but today seemed to be pulling in opposite directions. "Ms. Judge said carefully, I don't think we can proceed this way. The witness is clearly unable to testify in her current state. I'm considering calling a recess to." "Your Honor," Doctor's voice rang out as she stood abruptly from the gallery. "Your Honor, please, I have a request. It's unusual, but I believe it's Emma's only chance to testify." Every head in the courtroom turned toward the therapist. Judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite herself. "Approach the bench, Doctor." As the therapist walked forward, Emma watched through tear-blurred eyes, a tiny spark of hope flickering in her chest. She didn't know what Doctor was going to say, but somewhere deep inside, she knew who the therapist was thinking about. Bailey. Her Bailey. The one soul on earth who made her feel truly safe. And in that moment, Emma sent out a silent prayer that somehow, some way, her furry best friend might be allowed to save her one more time. Dr. Sarah's heels clicked purposefully against the marble floor as she approached the bench, her professional composure barely concealing the urgency she felt. Behind her, the courtroom buzzed with curious whispers. Judge leaned forward, her reading glasses perched on her nose, clearly intrigued by this unexpected interruption. "Your Honor," Doctor began, keeping her voice low but firm, "I've been working with Emma for the past 6 months as her trauma therapist. She suffers from selective mutism triggered by severe anxiety, specifically related to the traumatic event she witnessed." Judge nodded slowly. "I can see that, Doctor, but I'm not sure how this changes our current situation. The child clearly cannot testify." "She can, Your Honor, but not under these conditions." Doctor pulled out a folder from her briefcase, her hand steady despite her racing heart. "Emma has been working with a certified therapy dog named Bailey, a golden retriever specifically trained for trauma response. In our sessions, when Bailey is present, Emma's ability to communicate is completely normal. She can discuss the traumatic event in detail, answer complex questions, and maintain her composure." Ms. the prosecutor had joined them at the bench, her eyes widening with hope. "Your Honor, if there's any way to help Emma testify." "You want to bring a dog into my courtroom?" Judge interrupted, her tone balanced between skepticism and curiosity. She removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. In 15 years on the bench, she dealt with countless unusual requests, but this was a first. "Not just any dog, Your Honor. Bailey is a certified therapy animal registered with Therapy Dogs International. He's been through over 200 hours of specialized training." Doctor opened her folder, revealing certificates, training records, and medical documentation. "He's trained specifically for courtroom environments, high-stress situations, and working with traumatized children." His presence provides what we call grounding, a psychological anchor that allows Emma to access her cognitive functions despite her anxiety. Robert Hillman, the defense attorney, had caught wind of the discussion and quickly approached. "Your Honor, I must object to this entire conversation. A dog in the courtroom. This is a serious legal proceeding, not a petting zoo. The presence of a sympathetic animal could prejudice." "There is no jury, Mr. Hillman," Judge cut him off sharply. "This is a bench trial. I'm the only one making the determination of guilt or innocence." "Still, Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I've never heard of such a thing. What's the legal precedent for allowing animals in a courtroom during testimony?" Hillman's voice carried a note of desperation. He knew exactly what this meant. If Emma could testify, his client's chances of acquittal would plummet. Judge turned to her law clerk, a young woman named Jennifer Park who'd been furiously typing on her laptop throughout the exchange. "Ms. Park, what can you find?" Jennifer's fingers flew across the keyboard. "Your Honor, there are several cases. In 2011, a New York court allowed a dog to accompany a child witness in a sexual abuse case. In 2017, Arizona passed legislation specifically permitting facility dogs in courtrooms. And there's federal precedent under the Americans with Disabilities Act." "The ADA doesn't apply here," Hillman interrupted. "Emma isn't disabled." Doctor's eyes flashed. "Actually, Mr. Hillman, selective mutism is recognized as a disability under the ADA. Emma has been formally diagnosed. Bailey isn't a pet. He's a medical accommodation, no different than allowing a witness to use a wheelchair or hearing aid." Judge held up her hand for silence. The courtroom had gone completely quiet, everyone straining to hear the discussion at the bench. Even the court reporter had paused, waiting to see what would happen next. "Doctor," the judge said carefully, "explain to me exactly how this would work. Logistics, behavior, everything." Doctor straightened, sensing an opening. "Bailey would enter quietly with me. He would go directly to the witness stand and lie on a mat beside Emma's chair. He's trained to remain completely still and silent unless Emma signals distress, at which point he'll provide tactile comfort. He won't bark, won't move around the courtroom, won't interact with anyone except Emma. Most people won't even notice he's there after the first few minutes." "Most people will absolutely notice a 70-pound golden retriever in my courtroom," Judge said dryly. But there was a hint of amusement in her voice. "Your Honor, I understand this is unprecedented," Ms. interjected passionately. "But Emma is our only eyewitness to this crime. Without her testimony, walks free despite overwhelming circumstantial evidence. We're talking about an armed robbery. This man broke into an elderly veteran's home and stole items of both monetary and sentimental value. Mr. is 83 years old and now lives in fear in his own home. Emma saw it happen. She deserves the chance to tell her story, and the victim deserves justice." "What about the defendant's rights?" Hillman countered. "My client has the right to face his accuser in a traditional legal setting, not some therapy session with animals roaming around. This could be grounds for appeal." Judge stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Everyone stop." The authority in her voice was absolute. "I need to consider this carefully. Mr. Hillman, I understand your concerns about precedent and appeal. Ms., I understand the prosecution's need for this testimony. Doctor, I appreciate your professional expertise." She paused, looking out over the courtroom where Emma still sat in the witness chair, small and terrified, her mother watching anxiously from the gallery. The judge thought about her own daughter, now grown with children of her own. She thought about all the cases she'd presided over where justice couldn't be served because victims were too traumatized to speak. She thought about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. "Here's my decision," Judge announced, loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. "I'm going to allow it." The courtroom erupted. Gasps and excited whispers filled the air. Emma's mother let out a sob of relief. His face darkened considerably. Judge banged her gavel. "Order, let me finish. I'm allowing this under strict conditions. The dog must be a certified therapy animal, doctor. I'll need to see all documentation. The dog must remain calm and controlled at all times. If there is any disruption whatsoever, barking, aggression, wandering, the animal will be immediately removed and will return to our current situation. This allowance is made under the Americans with Disabilities Act as a reasonable accommodation for a witness with documented selective mutism. Mr. Hillman, your objection is noted for the record, and you may certainly appeal this decision if your client is convicted. Hillman opened his mouth to argue further, but Judge silenced him with a look. Furthermore, she continued, I want it understood that I'm making this decision in the interest of justice and the of a traumatized child witness. The presence of the therapy dog should not be interpreted as evidence of guilt or innocence. It is simply a tool to allow a witness to communicate. She turned to Doctor. How long will it take to bring Bailey here? Doctor checked her watch, her heart racing with a mixture of relief and anxiety. He's in my car in the parking garage, Your Honor. I brought him in case this happened. I can have him here in 10 minutes. You presumed quite a bit, Doctor, Judge said, though her tone wasn't unkind. I know Emma, Your Honor, and I know Bailey. This is her only chance. Doctor's voice carried absolute conviction. Judge nodded slowly, then addressed the entire courtroom. We're in recess for 30 minutes. When we reconvene, we will be joined by Emma's therapy dog. I expect everyone in this courtroom to treat this situation with the respect and seriousness it deserves. Bailiff, please ensure the witness and her mother have some privacy. Doctor, bring your dog. And Bailey better be as well behaved as you claim, or this experiment ends immediately. As the gavel came down, Doctor was already hurrying toward the exit, pulling out her phone to call her assistant who was waiting with Bailey in the parking garage. Behind her, Emma watched with wide eyes, hardly daring to hope. For the first time since entering that terrifying courtroom, a tiny smile flickered across her tear-stained face. Bailey was coming. Everything was going to be okay. The 30-minute recess felt like an eternity. Emma sat in a small witness waiting room with her mother, sipping water from a plastic cup and saying nothing. Maria held her daughter close, stroking her hair and whispering prayers in Spanish. Through the small window in the door, they could see the controlled chaos of the courthouse. Lawyers rushing past with briefcases, police officers escorting defendants, families waiting nervously on wooden benches worn smooth by decades of anxious fidgeting. Doctor had disappeared immediately after the judge's decision, practically running through the courthouse corridors toward the parking garage. Her assistant, Michael Torres, was waiting in her Silver with Bailey, who'd spent the last hour peacefully napping in his specially designed car harness. When Michael's phone rang, he answered before the first ring finished. She said yes, he asked breathlessly. Judge approved it. We're bringing Bailey in. Now. Doctor's voice trembled with a mixture of excitement and nerves. This was the moment they'd been preparing for, yet now that it was actually happening, the weight of responsibility felt enormous. I'll meet you at the east entrance in 3 minutes, Michael confirmed, already opening the car door. Bailey, sensing the sudden energy shift, lifted his golden head and yawned, his pink tongue curling. He shook himself, his red service vest with its official patches catching the parking garage's fluorescent lights. Bailey had been to hospitals, schools, nursing homes, and crisis centers, but never a courthouse. Still, he'd been trained for this. Doctor had made sure of it. Back in the courtroom, the spectators who'd remained during recess buzzed with conversation. News of what was about to happen had spread quickly through the courthouse. Additional observers had actually arrived, slipping into the back rows to witness this unprecedented event. Judge's law clerk had been fielding calls from other judges in the building who'd heard about the decision and were both curious and skeptical. Robert Hillman sat at the defense table, furiously typing notes on his laptop. He was already drafting the framework for an appeal, though part of him wondered if it would even be necessary. Maybe the dog would cause a disruption and be removed. Maybe Emma still wouldn't be able to testify even with the animal present. Maybe this whole situation would work in his favor. But another part of him, the part that had gone into public defense because he actually believed in helping people, felt uncomfortable with hopping a traumatized child would fail. Leaned over and whispered to his attorney, "This is ridiculous. A dog. They're going to let some mutt help convict me." Hillman held up a hand, silencing his client. "Don't say another word. Not here, not now." He defended enough guilty clients to recognize barely concealed arrogance, and it made his job considerably harder. Ms. the prosecutor stood by the window overlooking the street, watching for Doctor's arrival. She'd built her entire case around Emma's eyewitness testimony. Without it, she had circumstantial evidence, the stolen items found in his apartment, his lack of alibi, his previous record, but nothing that definitively placed him at the scene. Emma was the key to everything. At precisely 10:47 a.m., the east entrance doors opened, and Doctor entered with Michael Torres and Bailey. The golden retriever walked with practiced precision, his paws making soft clicking sounds against the marble floor. His tail was relaxed, not wagging excitedly but not tucked fearfully either, just the calm, neutral posture of a professional working dog. Several people in the hallway stopped and stared. "Is that dog going into the courtroom?" a young lawyer asked, incredulous. "History in the making," an older court officer replied, shaking his head in amazement. Bailey wore his red service vest emblazoned with patches, "Therapy Dog, Do Not Pet," and working. His golden coat had been brushed until it gleamed, and his dark brown eyes surveyed his surroundings with calm intelligence. Doctor had given him a thorough check before leaving the car, eyes clear, ears clean, paws inspected, breath fresh. He was as ready as any witness could be. They stopped outside courtroom 4B. Doctor knelt down to Bailey's level and looked into his eyes. "Okay, buddy, this is it. Emma needs you. Are you ready to work?" Bailey's tail gave a single, confident wag. He understood work. It was his favorite word besides treat and dinner. Michael handed Doctor the soft, cushioned mat they'd brought, specially designed to be quiet and non-disruptive. "You've got this," he said encouragingly. "Both of you." Doctor stood, took a deep breath, and nodded to the bailiff who'd been waiting by the door. "We're ready." The bailiff spoke into his radio. "Therapy Dog is here. Notify the judge." Inside the courtroom, Judge had already returned to the bench. When her bailiff's message came through her earpiece, she straightened her robes and addressed the room. "We're about to reconvene. I want to remind everyone that we are welcoming a certified therapy animal to assist our witness. This is not entertainment. This is a legitimate accommodation. I expect absolute professionalism and silence. If anyone cannot handle this appropriately, you're welcome to leave now." No one moved. If anything, people leaned forward in anticipation. "Bailiff, please bring them in." The heavy oak doors opened slowly, and the courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. Doctor entered first, her professional demeanor firmly in place despite her pounding heart, and then Bailey appeared. An audible gasp rippled through the gallery. Several people instinctively smiled. It was impossible not to when faced with a golden retriever, even in the solemnity of a courtroom. But they quickly suppressed their reactions, remembering the judge's warning. Bailey walked beside Doctor with perfect heel position, his eyes forward, completely unbothered by the dozens of staring humans. He'd been trained extensively in distraction work, could walk past dropped food, squeaky toys, even other dogs without breaking focus. A room full of quiet people was nothing. Emma, who'd been brought back to the witness stand during the recess, had been sitting with her head down, eyes closed, trying to control her breathing like Doctor had taught her. But she heard the door open. She heard the collective gasp. And she heard something else, the soft, familiar clicking of paws that she would recognize anywhere. Her head snapped up. Her eyes found Bailey instantly. And for the first time since entering that courthouse, Emma smiled. Not a small, hesitant smile, but a genuine, radiant expression of pure relief and joy that transformed her entire face. "Bailey," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. Bailey's ears perked forward at the sound of his name spoken by his favorite small human. His tail began to wag in earnest now, though he maintained his position beside Doctor, waiting for the release command that would allow him to go to Emma. Doctor approached the witness stand, and Judge gestured to the spot beside Emma's chair where the bailiff had already placed a designated area. "You may position the dog, Doctor." "Bailey, place," Doctor commanded softly, gesturing to the cushioned mat. Bailey walked the final few feet to the mat and lowered himself gracefully, settling into a calm downstay position. He was now directly beside Emma's chair, close enough that she could reach him easily but not so close that he was in the way or blocking anyone's view. The moment Bailey was in position, Emma's hand shot out and buried itself in the thick fur of his neck. Bailey leaned slightly into her touch, providing gentle pressure, his tail continuing its slow, steady wag. The transformation in Emma was instantaneous and miraculous. Her breathing slowed, her shoulders relaxed, the tension drained from her small body like water running out of a tub. Judge watched this interaction with undisguised amazement. She'd seen medication work, she'd seen therapy work, she'd seen time work, but she'd never seen anything work this quickly or this completely. The child who'd been unable to speak just 30 minutes ago was now visibly calmer, her fingers rhythmically stroking Bailey's soft ears. The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not the awkward, painful silence of Emma's earlier distress, but an awed, respectful silence as everyone witnessed the power of the human-animal bond in action. Even had stopped smirking. Even Robert Hillman looked moved, though he quickly composed his expression. The stenographer found her eyes misting and blinked rapidly, willing herself to maintain professionalism. Doctor returned to her seat in the gallery, giving Emma an encouraging nod. Ms. approached the witness stand once more, her steps careful, not wanting to disrupt the peaceful bubble that seemed to have formed around the girl and her dog. "Emma," the prosecutor began gently, "are you ready to try again?" Emma looked down at Bailey. The dog gazed up at her with those soulful brown eyes that seemed to say, "I'm here, you're safe, you can do this." Emma took a deep breath, her hand never leaving Bailey's head, and looked up at Ms. with clear, focused eyes. When she spoke, her voice was soft but steady, the voice of a child who'd finally found her courage. "Yes, I'm ready now." Felt a surge of relief wash over her as she heard Emma's voice, small but present, tentative but real. She'd spent weeks preparing for this testimony, but nothing could have prepared her for the emotional roller coaster of the past hour. Now, standing before the witness stand with Bailey's calm presence radiating throughout the courtroom, she felt they finally had a chance. "Emma, let's start with something simple," Ms. began, her voice warm and encouraging. "Can you tell the court your full name and how old you are?" Emma's fingers continued their rhythmic movement through Bailey's golden fur, drawing strength from each stroke. "My name is Emma Sophia. I'm 8 years old. I'll be 9 in December." The words came out quietly, but they were clear. Judge leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss a single syllable. "Thank you, Emma. That's wonderful. Now can you tell us where you live?" "I live at 847 Maple Street with my mom and my little brother Carlos. He's 5. Emma glanced down at Bailey, who gazed back at her with patient, loving eyes. His presence was like an anchor, keeping her grounded when everything else felt like it was spinning out of control. "And do you have a best friend, Emma?" Ms. knew these preliminary questions might seem irrelevant, but they served a crucial purpose, building Emma's confidence, establishing her as a witness, and helping her settle into the rhythm of testimony. A genuine smile crossed Emma's face. "Yes, her name is. We've been best friends since kindergarten. We're in 3rd grade together now at elementary." That's lovely, and lives near you, doesn't she? She lives across the street, at 852 Maple Street. Her house is yellow with white shutters. Emma was finding her rhythm now, each answer coming a little easier than the last. Bailey shifted slightly, adjusting his position to maintain contact with her leg, and she instinctively moved her hand to rest on his head. Ms. pulled out a photograph from her folder. Your Honor, I'd like to show the witness exhibit a photograph of Maple Street taken during daylight hours, showing the relationship between the and residences. Judge nodded. Proceed. Ms. handed the photograph to Emma. Can you identify the houses in this picture? Emma studied the image, her finger tracing across it. That's my house, the white one with the blue door, and that's house across the street, the yellow one. And that one, her voice wavered slightly, that's Mister's house, the gray one next to's. Bailey immediately sensed the change in Emma's emotional state. His ears perked forward, and he lifted his head slightly, pressing more firmly against her leg. Emma took a shaky breath and continued stroking his fur. You're doing great, Emma, just take your time. Ms.'s voice was steady and reassuring. Now, I want to ask you about a specific night. Do you remember the night of June 15th of this year? Emma nodded, her hand tightening in Bailey's fur. Yes, that was the night of the break-in. Can you tell us about that night? Start from the beginning. Where were you? Emma closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them, they were focused on Bailey rather than the courtroom full of people. It was easier to tell the story to Bailey, she realized. He'd heard it before in Doctor's office when the memories made her cry. He'd never judged her, never asked her to speak louder, never made her feel afraid. I was sleeping over at its house, Emma began, her voice soft but steady. Her mom said I could stay because it was Friday and there was no school the next day. We watched a movie, Frozen, even though we've seen it like 100 times, and had popcorn. We went to bed around 10 o'clock in its room. She has bunk beds and I always sleep on the bottom one. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter seemed to be holding her breath, her fingers poised over the keys but motionless, not wanting to break the spell with the clicking sound of transcription. What happened next, Emma? Ms. prompted gently. I fell asleep, but then I woke up. I was really thirsty. The popcorn had a lot of salt on it. Emma managed a small smile at this detail, and Bailey's tail wagged once in response to the slight lift in her mood. I looked at its clock. It was 2:07 in the morning. I know because it's one of those clocks that glows blue in the dark. So you woke up at 2:07 a.m. What did you do? I got out of bed really quietly because I didn't want to wake up. She sleeps really heavy anyway. One time her alarm went off for like 10 minutes and she didn't even hear it. Emma was finding comfort in the small details, the ordinary memories that came before the trauma. Bailey sensed she was doing okay and remained perfectly still, providing a solid, warm presence. I went downstairs to the kitchen. I know where everything is in its house because I've been there so many times. I got a glass from the cabinet, the one with the pink stripes, and filled it with water from the refrigerator door. The water dispenser is really loud, so I did it slowly. Ms. nodded encouragingly. You were in the kitchen getting water. Then what happened? Emma's hand stopped moving through Bailey's fur for a moment. Her breathing became slightly faster. Bailey immediately responded, shifting his position so that more of his body pressed against her legs. The physical contact was deliberate. It was one of the techniques Doctor had trained him to perform when he sensed rising anxiety in Emma. I was drinking the water, Emma continued, her voice smaller now, and I was standing by the kitchen window. Kitchen has a big window over the sink that looks out at the street. There's a street light right there on the corner, so even at night, you can see pretty well. What did you see, Emma? Ms.'s voice was barely above a whisper. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. Her hand resumed its movement through Bailey's fur, faster now, more urgent. I saw a man. At first I just saw a shadow moving and I thought maybe it was a cat or something. But then I saw it was a person, a man. He was wearing all dark clothes, black pants, a black hoodie, and a dark baseball cap pulled down low. The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, though no one actually moved. His expression had hardened, his jaw clenched tightly. Robert Hillman watched Emma carefully, already thinking about his cross-examination. "Where was this man?" Ms. asked. "He was at Mr.'s house, the gray house next to us. He was at the side window, the one that faces house. At first I didn't understand what he was doing. He was bent down doing something at the window, and then," Emma's voice cracked. Bailey immediately stood up on all fours, his training kicking in. He moved closer to Emma, positioning himself so his head rested on her knee, his weight providing deep pressure therapy. Emma wrapped both arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur for just a moment. The courtroom waited. When Emma lifted her head, tears were streaming down her cheeks, but her voice was stronger. Then I heard glass breaking. It wasn't super loud, kind of muffled, but I knew what it was. He'd broken Mr.'s window. I saw him reach through and unlock it from the inside. Then he pushed the window open and climbed through. He disappeared inside the house. "What did you do when you saw this?" Ms. asked. I froze. I was so scared. I wanted to scream for Mom, but my voice wouldn't work. I felt like I couldn't breathe. I just stood there holding my glass of water, watching. Emma's shame was evident in her voice. I should have done something. I should have yelled or called 911 or something. Judge surprised everyone by speaking up. "Emma, you were 8 years old alone at 2 in the morning. You didn't do anything wrong. Do you understand me?" Emma looked up at the judge and nodded, tears spilling over. Bailey licked her hand, a gentle reminder that he was there. Ms. continued, "How long was the man inside Mr.'s house?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe 10 minutes. It felt like forever. I could see a flashlight moving around inside. You could see it through the windows. He was going from room to room. I kept thinking Mr. was going to wake up and surprise him, but the house stayed dark. Later, I found out Mr. wasn't even home that night. He was visiting his daughter in Ohio." "What happened next?" "The man came back out through the same window he went in. He was carrying a big bag, like a duffel bag, and it looked heavy, full of stuff." Emma's voice grew steadier as she continued, the worst parts of the memory now spoken aloud. "He dropped down from the window and looked around. That's when I saw his face the clearest. The streetlight was shining right on him for a few seconds before he pulled his hood up more. Then he walked away, down the street, carrying the bag." "Which direction did he go?" "Toward Main Street, away from my house. He walked fast, like he was in a hurry but trying not to run and draw attention." Emma paused. "I stood at that window for a really long time after he left. I was shaking. Finally, I went back upstairs and got in bed, but I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night. I kept thinking he might come back." Ms. walked over to her table and picked up another photograph. "Emma, I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit C. This is a photograph of items recovered from a suspect's apartment. Do you recognize any of these items?" Emma looked at the photo, which showed an array of objects: a silver watch, a collection of military medals in a display case, an antique clock, and several pieces of jewelry. "I recognize the medal case. Mr. used to show it to us when we'd visit him. He was in the army in Vietnam. He was really proud of those medals. He said they belonged to his best friend who died in the war, and he'd promised to take care of them." Fresh tears appeared in Emma's eyes. "He cried when the police told him they were stolen." The emotion in the courtroom was palpable. Even some of the hardened law enforcement officers present found themselves affected by the child's testimony. Bailey remained pressed against Emma, his steady presence the only thing keeping her grounded enough to continue. Ms. knew she was approaching the crucial moment, the identification. "Emma, I need to ask you something very important. You said you saw the man's face in the streetlight. Do you remember what he looked like?" Emma nodded slowly, her hand gripping Bailey's fur so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "Can you describe him for the court?" Emma's voice was barely audible. He was tall, bigger than my mom. He had dark hair, I could see it under his cap, and his eyes, they were cold, mean-looking. She shuddered at the memory. Ms. knew what she had to ask next, but she dreaded it. This was the moment that could break Emma's composure entirely. "Emma, is that man here in this courtroom today?" Emma's breathing became rapid. Her whole body tensed, and Bailey, sensing the approaching crisis, prepared to do what he'd been trained to do, be exactly what Emma needed, exactly when she needed it most. The question hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Emma's entire body went rigid, her small frame trembling despite Bailey's warm presence beside her. Her eyes darted around the courtroom, to her mother in the gallery, to the judge, to the prosecutor, anywhere but where she knew she had to look. The place where sat at the defense table, his cold eyes boring into her with an intensity that made her stomach twist into knots. "Emma," Miss said gently, "take all the time you need." But time wasn't helping. If anything, the longer Emma sat there in silence, the more her panic grew. Her breathing became shallow and rapid, the beginning of what doctor recognized immediately as a panic attack. Emma's hand, which had been stroking Bailey's fur, now clutched it desperately, her knuckles white with tension. Bailey felt the change instantly. His therapy dog training had prepared him for exactly this moment. He could sense the spike in Emma's cortisol levels, could feel the tremors running through her small body, could hear the way her breathing had become erratic. He shifted his weight, pressing more firmly against her legs, providing deep pressure stimulation, a technique proven to calm anxiety. But it wasn't enough, not this time. Emma's vision started to blur. The courtroom seemed to spin around her. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, dozens of strangers waiting, watching, judging. And stare felt like it was burning through her skin. She'd seen those eyes before, illuminated by the streetlight on that terrible night. Those were the eyes that haunted her nightmares, that made her afraid of the dark, that had stolen her sense of safety. I can't," Emma whispered, her voice breaking. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the overwhelming terror that threatened to swallow her whole. Judge leaned forward, concern etched deeply on her face. She'd seen witnesses struggle before, but watching a child break down on the stand was particularly difficult. "Ms., perhaps we should take a brief." "Your Honor, just one more moment, please," Ms. interrupted, her eyes not on the judge but on Emma. She'd worked with traumatized children long enough to know that sometimes they needed to push through, not retreat. "Emma, sweetheart, look at me. Just at me." But Emma couldn't. Her eyes remained squeezed shut, her breathing coming in short, painful gasps. She was spiraling, falling back into that frozen state of terror that had silenced her when she first took the stand. All the progress they'd made was crumbling. Robert Hillman watched this unfolding disaster with mixed emotions. Professionally, he knew that if Emma couldn't identify his client, the prosecution's case would be severely weakened. But personally, watching a child suffer like this made him feel sick to his stomach. He glanced at who was watching Emma with an expression that could only be described as satisfied. Hillman looked away, disturbed. In the gallery, Maria half rose from her seat, instinctively wanting to run to her daughter. The bailiff placed a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder, shaking his head. Maria sat back down, tears streaming down her own face, her hands clasped together in desperate prayer. Doctor gripped the edge of her seat, mentally running through the techniques she'd taught Emma. "Come on, sweetie," she whispered under her breath. "Remember your training, remember Bailey's signals. You can do this." And then, as if he'd heard Doctor's thoughts from across the courtroom, Bailey made his move. Without any command from anyone, operating purely on his training and his deep bond with Emma, Bailey stood up on all four legs. He positioned himself directly in front of Emma's knees, forcing her to acknowledge his presence. Then, with a gentleness that belied his 70-pound frame, he placed his large golden head on Emma's lap and looked up at her with those deep, soulful brown eyes. Emma's eyes flew open at the touch. She looked down and found herself staring into Bailey's face, so close she could see the flecks of amber in his brown irises, could feel his warm breath on her hands. Bailey held her gaze with an intensity that seemed almost human, a look that said, "I'm here. You're not alone. I believe in you." Something shifted in Emma. In Bailey's eyes, she didn't see judgment or expectation or fear. She saw only unconditional love and absolute faith. Bailey had never let her down. Every time she'd been scared, he'd been there. Every time she'd cried in doctor's office, unable to speak about the nightmares, Bailey had laid his head on her lap just like this and somehow made it bearable. Emma took a shaky breath, then another. Her hand moved from clutching Bailey's fur to gently stroking his soft ears. "Good boy," she whispered, so quietly that only Bailey could hear. "You're such a good boy." Bailey's tail wagged once, twice. His tongue darted out and gave Emma's hand the gentlest of licks, his way of saying, "You've got this." The courtroom remained frozen, everyone watching this intimate moment between a traumatized child and her therapy dog. Even Judge, who had been about to call a recess, held her tongue, sensing that something important was happening. Emma continued to stroke Bailey's ears, his head still resting heavily on her lap. The weight of him, the warmth, the steady rise and fall of his breathing, it all worked together to ground her, to pull her back from the edge of panic. She remembered what Doctor had taught her. When you feel overwhelmed, focus on Bailey. Focus on what you can touch, what you can feel. Let him be your anchor. Slowly, gradually, Emma's breathing began to normalize. The spinning sensation in her head slowed, then stopped. The courtroom came back into focus. She could see Ms. standing patiently, waiting. She could see Judge watching with kind, encouraging eyes. She could see her mother in the back, giving her a brave smile despite her tears. And then Emma made a decision. She couldn't keep living in fear. She couldn't let those cold eyes control her life anymore. Mr. deserved justice, and she had Bailey, her brave, loyal, wonderful Bailey, right here with her. "I'm ready," Emma said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been all morning. "I can do it now." Ms. eyes widened with surprise and hope. "Are you sure, Emma? We can take a break if—" "No, I need to do this now." Emma straightened in her chair, one hand still resting on Bailey's head. The dog remained in position, his weight on her lap, knowing instinctively that she still needed him there. "Okay, sweetheart, the question was, is the man you saw that night here in this courtroom today?" Ms. asked, her voice gentle but clear. Emma took a deep breath. Bailey's presence gave her courage, but she knew what she had to do. She had to look at him. She had to face those cold eyes that had terrified her for months. Her heart pounded so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "Emma," Ms. prompted softly, "is he here?" Emma's hand tightened in Bailey's fur one more time, drawing strength from her four-legged guardian. Then slowly she turned her head. Her eyes swept across the courtroom, past the empty jury box, past the court reporter, past the bailiff, until they landed on the defense table. Sat there in his ill-fitting suit, his expression now carefully neutral, but his eyes, those eyes were exactly the same as they'd been in the streetlight's glow. Cold, hard, mean. For a moment, Emma faltered. Those eyes seemed to reach across the courtroom and wrap around her throat, threatening to silence her again. She felt her courage wavering, felt the fear rising up to choke her. But then Bailey shifted slightly on her lap, pressing his nose against her stomach, a gesture of support, of love, of unwavering faith. And Emma realized something. Eyes couldn't hurt her anymore. Not with Bailey here. Not with her mother watching. Not with all these people who believed in her, who wanted to help her, who were giving her this chance to speak the truth. Emma lifted her hand from Bailey's head. She pointed directly at, her finger unwavering despite the tremor in her arm. When she spoke, her voice was clear enough that every person in that courtroom heard every single word. "That's him, that's the man I saw break into Mister's house. I'm absolutely sure." The courtroom erupted. Whispers exploded through the gallery like fireworks. His carefully neutral expression cracked, replaced by a scowl of anger. Robert Hillman closed his eyes briefly, knowing his case had just become exponentially more difficult. Maria let out a sob of relief and pride, her hands pressed to her mouth. Judge banged her gavel. "Order! I will have order in this court." But Ms. was focused entirely on Emma. "Emma, are you certain? You understand how important this is?" Emma nodded, her hand returning to Bailey's head, drawing comfort but no longer desperately clutching. "Yes, I'm certain. That's him. I saw his face in the streetlight and I remember it. That's the man who broke Mistress' window and stole his things. That's—" She'd said his name, out loud, in front of everyone. The man who'd haunted her nightmares for months was no longer a nameless terror. He was just a man, sitting at a table, about to face justice for what he'd done. Bailey, sensing that the crisis had passed, carefully removed his paws from Emma's lap and returned to his mat beside the witness chair. But he kept his head raised, watching Emma attentively, ready to provide support again at a moment's notice. Miss smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears of relief and admiration. "Thank you, Emma. You're incredibly brave." She turned to Judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to show the witness Exhibit D, a baseball cap recovered from the defendant's apartment." As the prosecutor continued her questioning, Emma answered each question clearly and confidently. She described the cap she'd seen the intruder wearing, dark blue or black, with some kind of logo on the front. When shown the recovered cap, she confirmed it looked exactly like what she'd seen. She described the duffel bag the man had carried, the way he'd walked away from the scene, even the approximate time it had taken for him to be inside the house. Every detail matched the physical evidence, the timeline established by Mr. Security System, and the items found in his apartment 3 days after the robbery. Emma was no longer a frightened, silent child frozen by trauma. With Bailey beside her, she'd found her voice, and that voice was strong, clear, and impossible to ignore. When Ms. finally said, "No further questions, Your Honor," Emma took her first full, deep breath since entering the courtroom that morning. She looked down at Bailey, who gazed back at her with obvious pride, his tail wagging in that slow, steady rhythm that said everything was going to be okay. But Emma's ordeal wasn't over yet. Robert Hillman stood up, straightening his tie, preparing for cross-examination. And Emma, watching him approach, felt her anxiety beginning to rise once more. Robert Hillman approached the witness stand with careful deliberation, his expression neutral but his mind racing. He was a seasoned public defender who'd cross-examined hundreds of witnesses, but never had he felt quite this much pressure. Cross-examining a traumatized 8-year-old with a therapy dog was navigating completely uncharted territory. One wrong move, appearing too aggressive, too intimidating, too unsympathetic, and he'd lose whatever slim chance his client had, not to mention face public backlash that could haunt his career for years. "Good morning, Emma," he began, his voice deliberately soft and friendly. "My name is Mr. Hillman. I'm going to ask you a few questions, okay? If you don't understand something, just let me know and I'll ask it differently." Emma nodded slightly, her hand instinctively moving back to Bailey's head. The golden retriever remained on his mat, calm and watchful, but his dark eyes tracked every movement the defense attorney made. "Emma, you saw this incident at approximately 2:07 in the morning. Is that correct?" "Yes," Emma answered quietly but clearly. "That's very late at night, isn't it? Or very early in the morning, depending on how you look at it." Hillman offered a small smile, trying to appear non-threatening. "I guess so. I was awake because I was thirsty." "Right, yes, you mentioned that. The popcorn was salty." Hillman consulted his notes. "Now, Emma, when you're awake in the middle of the night like that, sometimes our minds can play tricks on us. We might see shadows and think there's something else. Has that ever happened to you?" Ms. tensed in her seat, ready to object if the questioning became inappropriate, but she held back for now. Judge leaned forward slightly, also monitoring the exchange carefully. Emma shook her head. No, I was really awake. I wasn't dreaming or confused. I saw what I saw. I'm not suggesting you were dreaming, Hillman said quickly, maintaining his gentle tone. I'm just asking about the conditions. It was nighttime, it was dark. There was a streetlight, Emma interrupted, her voice gaining confidence. Right on the corner by his house. It's really bright. My mom says it's too bright. She's complained to the city about it because it shines in her bedroom window when I sleep at home. Hillman nodded, making a note. Okay, so there was a streetlight, but you were looking through a window from inside the house across the street to another house. That's quite a distance, isn't it? Our houses are really close together. That's why my mom knows Mom so well. We can talk to each other from our porches. Emma's hand continued to stroke Bailey's soft fur, the repetitive motion helping her stay calm. How close would you say? 20 feet, 30 feet? I don't know exactly, but not far. Maybe like from here to that back wall. Emma pointed to the rear of the courtroom, approximately 40 feet away. Hillman made another note. Emma, you said the man was wearing a hoodie and a baseball cap pulled down low. Doesn't that mean his face was partially covered? Emma paused, thinking carefully. The hoodie was up when he walked away, but not the whole time. When he first broke the window and when he came back out, I could see his face in the streetlight. But he had a cap on, correct? Pulled down low, you said. Yes, but I could still see his face, his eyes and his nose and his mouth. Emma's voice wavered slightly. The memory of that face was still frightening, even with Bailey beside her. Hillman sensed her discomfort and pressed forward, knowing he had to challenge her testimony despite how uncomfortable it made him feel. Emma, how long would you say you actually saw his face clearly? A few seconds? A minute? I don't know. It felt like a long time, but maybe it was just a few seconds when he was in the light. Emma's breathing started to quicken. Her hand, which had been moving smoothly through Bailey's fur, began to tremble slightly. Bailey's ears perked up. He'd been monitoring Emma's physiological state continuously, her breathing rate, her body temperature, the tension in her muscles, the tremor in her hands. All his training was focused on reading these signals, and right now, they were telling him that Emma's stress levels were climbing rapidly. Just a few seconds, Hillman repeated, his tone thoughtful rather than accusatory. Emma, I have a daughter about your age. She's 9. And sometimes when I ask her about something that happened even just last week, she gets details mixed up. It's normal, our memories aren't perfect. Is it possible that in the stress and fear of that moment, you might not remember everything exactly as it happened? I remember, Emma said, but her voice was smaller now, less certain. The doubt Hillman was planting was beginning to take root, not because she was actually uncertain, but because he was an authority figure questioning her, and she was only 8 years old. You remember seeing someone break into a house. That must have been terrifying, Hillman continued, his voice full of sympathy. But are you absolutely, 100% certain that the person you saw that night is the same person sitting at that table right now? Because this is very important, Emma. A man's freedom depends on your certainty. The weight of those words crashed down on Emma like a physical force. A man's freedom. What if she was wrong? What if her memory was confused? What if the darkness and fear had made her see things incorrectly? What if she sent an innocent person to prison? Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her chest felt tight. The courtroom started to feel too hot, too small, too crowded. All those eyes staring at her, judging her, depending on her. The responsibility was crushing. Emma, Hillman prompted gently, are you certain? Emma opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The familiar paralysis was returning, the fear wrapping around her throat like invisible hands. Her vision started to blur at the edges. She could feel herself slipping back into that terrified silence, back into the place where words disappeared and only panic remained. Bailey stood up immediately, his training taking over. He pressed against Emma's legs, providing pressure, providing presence. but he could sense that this crisis was escalating beyond his standard interventions. Emma's cortisol levels were spiking dramatically. Her breathing was approaching hyperventilation. She was seconds away from a full panic attack. Doctor gripped the armrest of her bench in the gallery, watching anxiously. She'd seen Emma like this in therapy sessions, and she knew what came next if they didn't intervene. But what could she do from across the courtroom? She couldn't call out, couldn't rush to Emma's side. All she could do was watch and hope that Emma remembered her training. Judge was about to call a recess when she saw Emma's hand move. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't watching carefully. Emma's right hand lifted from Bailey's head and moved to her own chest. She tapped her chest gently once, twice, then made a fist and pressed it against her heart. The gesture took perhaps 2 seconds, subtle and quick. But Bailey saw it instantly. Doctor gasped audibly, recognizing the signal they'd practiced dozens of times in therapy sessions. It was one of several signals she'd taught Emma, specific gestures that corresponded to different therapeutic interventions Bailey was trained to provide. This particular signal meant deep pressure therapy, a technique used to calm severe anxiety, prevent panic attacks, and provide a sense of safety and grounding. Emma had never used this signal in public before. She'd only used it in the safe, controlled environment of Doctor's office. But here, in this moment of desperate need, her body had remembered the training. Her hand had formed the signal almost unconsciously, a cry for help in a language only Bailey understood. And Bailey, magnificent Bailey, responded with the precision of a master at his craft. In one fluid, powerful motion, the golden retriever reared up on his hind legs. His front paws landed squarely on Emma's lap with gentle but firm pressure. Then he leaned forward, pressing his full 70-pound weight against Emma's chest and torso, his furry body enveloping her in a cocoon of warmth and pressure. The courtroom froze in collective shock. Judge's hand, which had been reaching for her gavel, stopped in midair. Her mouth fell open in astonishment. Ms. stood up from her chair, uncertain whether to intervene or let this play out. Robert Hillman stepped back instinctively, his cross-examination forgotten as he stared at the remarkable scene unfolding before him. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward, some rising from their seats to see better, gasps and whispers filling the air. The court reporter's fingers froze over her keyboard, her professional detachment crumbling as tears sprang to her eyes. Even leaned forward, his expression shifting from satisfied to confused to something that might have been concern, or perhaps just frustration that his case was slipping away. But Emma was aware of none of this. Her entire world had narrowed to the warm, solid weight of Bailey pressed against her chest. She wrapped both arms around his neck, pulling him closer, burying her face completely in his soft golden fur. She could feel his heartbeat, steady, calm, unwavering. She could hear his breathing, deep and regular, not panicked like hers. She could smell his familiar scent, a mixture of dog shampoo and something uniquely Bailey that always made her feel safe. The deep pressure of his weight against her chest worked like magic. It was a technique based on science. Deep pressure stimulation triggers the release of serotonin and dopamine, neurotransmitters that promote calmness and happiness. It's why weighted blankets help people with anxiety. It's why swaddling calms bobbies. And for Emma, in this moment, with Bailey's substantial weight pressing against her, it was exactly what her nervous system needed. Slowly, second by second, Emma's breathing began to slow. The tight band around her chest loosened. The spinning sensation in her head decreased. The fog of panic that had been descending over her mind lifted like morning mist under sunshine. She kept her face buried in Bailey's fur for what felt like an eternity, but was actually only about 30 seconds. In that half-minute, the courtroom remained absolutely silent. No one spoke. No one moved. Everyone simply watched this profound moment of healing, this wordless communication between a traumatized child and her therapy dog. When Emma finally pulled her face away from Bailey's fur, her cheeks were wet with tears, but her eyes were clear, focused, determined. She looked down at Bailey, who gazed back at her with those infinitely patient, loving brown eyes, and she whispered, "Thank you, Bailey. Good boy, such a good boy." Bailey's tail wagged, pleased with himself. His job was to help Emma, and he could sense that she was better now, calmer, more grounded. But he remained in position, his weight still pressed against her, until she gave him the signal that she was okay. Emma took a deep, full breath, the first one that had filled her lungs completely in several minutes. She gently placed her hands on Bailey's chest and gave him a soft push, the signal they'd practiced that meant, "I'm okay now." Bailey immediately but carefully lowered himself back to all fours, then settled onto his mat, though he kept his head raised and his eyes fixed on Emma, ready to respond again if needed. Emma turned to face Robert Hillman, who still stood frozen several feet away, his notes forgotten in his hand. When she spoke, her voice was steady, clear, and filled with a conviction that sent chills through everyone present. "I am certain," she said, each word deliberate and strong. "I know what I saw. I've seen that face in my nightmares every single night since June 15th. I wake up scared because I see those eyes, his eyes. I don't want to remember, but I do. I remember everything. And yes, I am absolutely 100% certain that is the man I saw break into Mister's house." The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, not shocked, but awed. Everyone had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that transcended normal courtroom procedure and touched something deeper, more human, more profound. Judge slowly lowered her hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. In 30 years of legal practice, she'd never seen anything like what she'd just witnessed. She looked at Emma, this brave, traumatized little girl who just demonstrated more courage than many adults, and then at Bailey, who'd responded to his small human's need with such precision and compassion that it seemed almost miraculous. The silence in courtroom 4B was profound, almost sacred. It was as if everyone present, from Judge on her elevated bench to the janitor who'd slipped in through the back door to see what the commotion was about, understood they were witnessing something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of a legal proceeding. This wasn't just about a robbery case anymore. This was about healing, courage, and the extraordinary bond between a traumatized child and the animal who'd become her lifeline. Judge sat motionless, her gavel still suspended in her hand, her mouth slightly open in an expression of pure astonishment. In her 15 years on the bench, she presided over thousands of cases, murders, assaults, fraud, corruption, every type of human transgression imaginable. She'd seen witnesses break down, she'd seen dramatic confessions, she'd seen surprising verdicts. But never, not once, had she seen anything like what had just unfolded before her eyes. The moment seemed frozen in time. Bailey remained on his mat beside Emma's chair, his golden head held high with dignified pride, his dark eyes watchful and alert. His tail gave an occasional gentle wag, the only movement in the entire courtroom. Emma sat in the witness chair, her small hands now resting calmly in her lap, her tear-stained face radiant with a newfound confidence that seemed to glow from within. Her chest rose and fell with steady, normal breaths. No more gasping, no more panic, just the peaceful breathing of a child who'd found her courage. In the gallery, Maria had both hands pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her face, but these were tears of joy and overwhelming pride. Her baby girl, her Emma, had just done something impossibly brave. Maria wanted to run to her daughter, sweep her up in her arms, tell her how proud she was, but she remained in her seat, knowing Emma needed to finish this journey on her own terms. Dr. Sarah sat with tears openly flowing down her cheeks, not bothering to wipe them away. She'd worked with hundreds of trauma patients over her 20-year career, had seen therapy dogs work countless miracles, but this was different. This was the culmination of 6 months of patient work, of building trust, of teaching Emma that she had the tools within herself to face her fears. And Bailey, her wonderful, perfectly trained Bailey, had responded exactly as she'd trained him to, but with something extra, something that couldn't be taught. He'd responded with love. Even the court reporter, a woman named who'd been transcribing testimony for 12 years with professional detachment, had stopped typing. Her fingers hovered over the keys, trembling slightly as she blinked back tears. She'd have to note in the official transcript. Witness became distressed. Therapy dog provided intervention. Witness recovered and continued testimony. But those dry, legal words could never capture what had actually happened in this room. Robert Hillman stood frozen, his cross-examination notes dangling forgotten from his hand. He was a father himself, had a 9-year-old daughter named Sophie who was afraid of thunderstorms, and watching Emma's struggle had affected him more deeply than he'd expected. He'd been doing his job, trying to poke holes in her testimony, trying to create reasonable doubt. But seeing her signal Bailey, seeing the dog respond with such immediate understanding, seeing the transformation as Emma found her courage again, it had shaken something loose inside him. He glanced back at his client, who sat at the defense table with an expression that was difficult to read. His earlier smugness had vanished, replaced by something that looked almost like discomfort. Even he, hardened criminal that he was, seemed moved by what he'd witnessed. Or perhaps he simply recognized that his chances of acquittal had just evaporated like morning dew under a hot sun. Assistant District Attorney Jennifer stood near the prosecution table, one hand pressed against her chest as if trying to keep her heart from bursting out. She'd been so afraid that Emma wouldn't be able to testify, that the case would fall apart, that justice wouldn't be served. But now, watching Emma sit tall in the witness chair with Bailey beside her, felt something she rarely allowed herself to feel in her work: hope. Not just hope for this case, but hope for a justice system that could adapt, could show compassion, could recognize that there were many paths to truth. The bailiff, a gruff 30-year veteran named Tom, no relation to Emma's family, stood by the door with his arms crossed, but his eyes were suspiciously bright. He'd seen it all in 3 decades, defendants trying to escape, witnesses collapsing, attorneys throwing punches at each other. But he'd never seen anything like this. He found himself thinking about his own grandson, who had autism and worked with a therapy dog. Maybe, he thought, the world was finally starting to understand what animals could do for people who were struggling. In the back row, a young law student named who'd come to observe the trial for her criminal procedure class sat with her notebook open, but completely blank. She'd been supposed to take notes on courtroom procedure, on examination techniques, on evidentiary rulings. Instead, she just witnessed something that would change her entire understanding of what justice could look like. She made a mental note to research therapy animals in legal proceedings. Maybe this could be her law review article. Maybe this could be her life's work. Judge finally moved. She slowly lowered her gavel, set it down gently on the bench, and removed her reading glasses. She rubbed her eyes, whether to clear tears or simply to process what she'd seen. No one could tell. When she looked up again, her expression had transformed from shock to something softer, warmer, more human than judges typically allowed themselves to show in court. "I need a moment," she said, her voice thick with emotion. It wasn't a request. It was a simple statement of fact. Even judges were human, and humans needed time to process extraordinary events. The courtroom remained silent, respectfully giving her that space. Judge looked at Emma, really looked at her, saw the brave little girl who'd been unable to speak just an hour ago, who'd been drowning in trauma and fear, and who just demonstrated more courage than most adults would show in a lifetime. Then she looked at Bailey, the magnificent golden retriever who'd done what months of therapy and medication and support couldn't quite accomplish, given Emma the strength to face her fears in the moment when it mattered most. "Emma," Judge said finally, her voice gentle but carrying clearly through the courtroom, "what I just witnessed was remarkable. You should be very proud of yourself. And Bailey," she actually smiled at the dog who perked his ears forward at the sound of his name, "you, sir, are a very good boy." A ripple of soft laughter moved through the courtroom, breaking some of the tension. Even Emma smiled, her hand reaching down to stroke Bailey's head with obvious affection and gratitude. Judge turned to Robert Hillman. "Mr. Hillman, do you wish to continue your cross-examination?" Hillman looked at Emma, at Bailey, at his client, and then at his notes. He could continue questioning. He could try to further undermine Emma's certainty, point out the darkness, the distance, the brief glimpse. He could do his job as a defense attorney and create as much reasonable doubt as possible. But something had shifted in him during those 30 seconds when Bailey pressed against Emma's chest, and the courtroom held its collective breath. He'd seen something pure and true, a child facing her worst fear and finding the courage to speak anyway. And suddenly, all his legal maneuvering felt hollow, meaningless against the weight of that truth. "No, Your Honor," Hillman said quietly. "No further questions." Judge's eyebrows rose slightly. She'd expected him to push harder, but she simply nodded. "Ms., any redirect?" The prosecutor stood, but she knew there was nothing more to be said. Emma's testimony was complete, powerful, and unshakable. "No, Your Honor. The witness has clearly and completely." "Very well, Emma, you may step down, and thank you truly for your courage today." Judge's voice carried genuine warmth and admiration. Emma stood up from the witness chair, her legs slightly shaky but holding strong. Bailey immediately stood as well, positioning himself beside her, ready to provide support if needed. Doctor rose from her seat in the gallery, ready to receive them. But as Emma took her first step away from the witness stand, something unexpected happened. She paused, turned, and looked directly at the man who'd haunted her nightmares, who'd stolen her sense of safety, who'd made her afraid of the dark. He stared back at her, their eyes meeting across the courtroom. And Emma didn't look away. She didn't tremble or freeze or panic. With Bailey beside her and her newfound courage burning bright inside her chest, she held his gaze for 3 long seconds. It was a moment of quiet power, the victim refusing to be intimidated by her perpetrator, a child showing an adult what real strength looked like. Then Emma turned away, her hand resting on Bailey's head, and walked steadily out of the witness stand area. As she passed through the gallery, heading toward the back of the courtroom where her mother waited, something extraordinary happened. Slowly, one by one, people began to stand. First the young law student in the back row, then the bailiff by the door, then court staff members, spectators, even some of the police officers present. They weren't applauding. Judge would never have allowed that, but they were standing in silent acknowledgement of what they'd witnessed. A standing ovation given through stillness and respect. Maria met her daughter halfway down the aisle, dropping to her knees and pulling Emma into a fierce hug. Me, she whispered into Emma's hair. "I'm so proud of you, so proud." Emma hugged her mother back, feeling the last remnants of her fear dissolve in the warmth of that embrace. Bailey sat patiently beside them, his tail wagging, clearly pleased that his job was done and done well. Judge watched this reunion, making no move to restore order or hurry things along. Some moments were more important than courtroom protocol. After a respectful pause, she gently tapped her gavel once. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," she announced. "When we return, we'll hear closing arguments." As the courtroom began to empty for the break, conversations erupted, people talking excitedly about what they'd just witnessed, pulling out phones to text friends and colleagues, already knowing that this story would spread far beyond this one courtroom. Judge remained on the bench, watching as Emma, Maria, Bailey, and Doctor made their way out of the courtroom together, a small family united by love and healing. The judge picked up her pen and made a note in her personal journal, something she rarely did. "Today I witnessed the future of justice. It has 4 legs and a wagging tail, and it gave an 8-year-old girl the courage to speak truth to power. We have much to learn from this." In the holding area outside the courtroom, Emma sat on a bench with Bailey's head in her lap, finally allowing herself to fully relax. Doctor knelt beside them, her hand on Emma's shoulder. "You did it, sweetheart," Doctor said softly. You faced your biggest fear and you won." Emma looked down at Bailey, whose tongue was hanging out in a happy pant, his eyes sparkling with contentment. "We did it," Emma corrected. "Bailey and me, we did it together." And in that moment, surrounded by the people who loved her most, with her faithful companion resting peacefully against her, Emma finally felt something she hadn't felt since that terrible night in June. She felt safe, she felt strong, she felt like herself again. The miracle in Courtroom 4B wasn't just that a dog had helped a child testify. The miracle was that a traumatized little girl had discovered her own power, had learned that courage isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward despite it. Bailey hadn't given her that courage. He'd simply helped her find what was already inside her. And that, Judge would later reflect, was the most extraordinary thing of all. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, sunlight streaming through the tall windows of Courtroom 4B as if nature itself wanted to witness the conclusion of this extraordinary case. Emma wasn't required to be present for the verdict. Judge had made that clear, wanting to spare the child any additional stress. But Emma had insisted on coming. She needed to see this through to the end. And of course, Bailey was by her side. Judge entered the courtroom at exactly 9:00 a.m., her black robes flowing behind her, her expression composed but thoughtful. She'd spent the previous evening and most of the night carefully reviewing every piece of evidence, every testimony, every legal precedent. The decision she was about to announce would affect not just this case, but potentially countless cases to come. The courtroom was even more packed than the day before. Word had spread about the remarkable testimony involving the therapy dog, and local news crews waited outside, forbidden from entering but eager to capture reactions. Inside, every seat was filled. Mr. the elderly veteran whose home had been violated sat in the front row, his weathered hands clasped tightly together. Beside him sat his daughter, who'd flown in from Ohio to support him and witness justice for her father. Emma sat with her mother in the third row, Bailey lying calmly at her feet on his mat. Doctor sat beside them, her hand resting supportively on Maria's shoulder. Emma wore her favorite dress, the blue one with sunflowers that her grandmother had given her for her 8th birthday. She'd told her mother that morning, "I want to look nice when the judge says he's guilty." Her certainty was absolute. Sat at the defense table in the same ill-fitting suit, but his demeanor had changed dramatically. The cockiness was gone, replaced by a tense resignation. Robert Hillman sat beside him, his legal pad covered with notes from his all-night preparation of appeal documents. He'd done his job to the best of his ability, but he knew what was coming. Judge settled into her seat, adjusted her microphone, and looked out over the assembled crowd. "This court will come to order," she announced, and the room fell instantly silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the polished marble floor. "This has been an unusual case in many respects," Judge began, her voice clear and measured. "We've dealt with novel legal questions, unconventional accommodations, and circumstances that have challenged my understanding of what justice can and should look like." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the courtroom. "But at its heart, this case comes down to something very simple. What is the truth, and how do we ensure that truth can be heard, even when it comes from the most vulnerable among us?" Emma squeezed her mother's hand. Bailey, sensing her tension, lifted his head and placed it on her knee. She stroked his soft ears, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "I've reviewed all the evidence presented in this case," Judge continued. "The timeline established by Mr. Security System, which shows his window alarm was triggered at 2:13 a.m. on June 15th. The physical evidence, the broken window, the stolen items later recovered from the defendant's apartment, the defendant's lack of a credible alibi for that evening, and most importantly, the eyewitness testimony of Emma." At the mention of her name, Emma sat up. Judge looked directly at her and offered a small, encouraging smile before continuing. "Mr. Hillman has argued that Emma's identification should be questioned due to the nighttime conditions, the distance, and the brief time she had to observe the perpetrator. These are reasonable concerns, and I've given them serious consideration. However, I find Emma's testimony to be credible, consistent, and compelling. Her description of events matches the physical evidence in every detail. Her identification of the defendant was clear and unwavering. And most significantly, the emotional impact of witnessing this crime, evident in her trauma and difficulty testifying, actually supports rather than undermines her credibility. His jaw clenched. He stared straight ahead, refusing to look at Emma or anyone else in the courtroom. Furthermore, Judge said, her voice taking on a harder edge, items stolen from Mr.'s home were found in the defendant's apartment just 3 days after the robbery. The defendant has provided no credible explanation for how he came to possess these items. A baseball cap matching Emma's description was also found in his apartment. The defendant has a prior criminal record including breaking and entering. All of this evidence taken together paints a clear picture. The judge paused, taking a deliberate breath. The courtroom seemed to lean forward collectively. Emma's hand tightened in her mother's grasp. Bailey's tail gave a single, slow wag, as if he too understood the importance of this moment. Therefore, in the matter of the state versus, on the charge of breaking and entering with intent to commit theft, I find the defendant guilty. Judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtroom like thunder. The room erupted. Mr. let out a choked sob of relief, his daughter wrapping her arms around him. Maria pulled Emma into a fierce hug, tears streaming down both their faces. Doctor wiped her eyes, overcome with emotion. Spectators whispered excitedly, some applauding before the bailiff gestured for quiet. Emma buried her face in her mother's shoulder, her body shaking, not with fear this time, but with relief so profound it felt physical. Bailey stood up, pressing against her legs, always attuned to her emotional state. Emma reached down to hug him, whispering, "We did it, Bailey. He can't hurt anyone else now." Judge banged her gavel again, calling for order. "I'm not finished," she announced, and the room quickly quieted. "On the charge of grand theft, I also find the defendant guilty. On the charge of possession of stolen property, guilty." His head dropped into his hands. Robert Hillman placed a hand on his client's shoulder, a gesture of professional support if not personal sympathy. "Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks," Judge continued. "However, I want to say something before we adjourn." She removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Emma again. "Emma, would you please stand?" Emma's eyes widened in surprise. Her mother nodded encouragingly. Slowly, Emma stood, Bailey immediately standing beside her, always her shadow, always her support. "Emma, what you did yesterday required extraordinary courage," Judge said, her voice warm but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "You faced your fear, you told the truth, and you helped ensure that justice was served. But more than that, you've helped change the way this court, and potentially courts across this country, think about how we can better serve traumatized witnesses, especially children." The judge's eyes moved to Bailey. "And Bailey, you remarkable dog, you've shown us all the power of compassion, training, and the incredible bond between humans and animals. You didn't just help Emma testify, you helped her heal." Bailey's tail wagged faster, as if he understood the praise being directed his way. Several people in the courtroom laughed softly, the tension breaking slightly. "Which brings me to my final point," Judge said, her tone becoming more formal again. "What happened in this courtroom yesterday was unprecedented in this jurisdiction. After extensive research and consultation, I've decided to draft a formal proposal to the state judicial system. I'm recommending the establishment of comprehensive guidelines for allowing certified therapy animals in courtrooms to assist vulnerable witnesses, particularly children, victims of violent crimes, and individuals with diagnosed trauma-related conditions." A murmur of excitement rippled through the courtroom. Doctor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. This was more than she'd ever hoped for. "These guidelines will include certification requirements, behavioral standards, and protocols for implementation," Judge continued. I'll be citing Emma's case as the primary example of why such accommodations are not just beneficial but sometimes essential to the pursuit of justice. I cannot in good conscience allow this to be a one-time occurrence when there are undoubtedly other children, other victims, other witnesses who could benefit from similar support. Ms. stood up, unable to contain herself. Your Honor, the District Attorney's Office fully supports this initiative and would be honored to assist in its development. Judge nodded. I appreciate that, Ms. I'll be reaching out to various stakeholders in the coming weeks. She turned back to Emma. Emma, you may not realize it yet, but what you did here will help other children who are scared and hurting. You and Bailey have started something important. You should be very proud. Emma felt tears streaming down her face again, but these were different tears, tears of pride, of accomplishment, of knowing that her nightmare had been transformed into something meaningful. She looked down at Bailey, who gazed up at her with those infinitely loving brown eyes, and she knew that she would never forget this moment as long as she lived. Judge's gavel came down one final time. This court is adjourned. Mr. You'll remain in custody pending sentencing. Bailiff, please escort the defendant. As was led away in handcuffs, he glanced back once at Emma. But there was no intimidation in his look this time, just the defeated expression of a man who'd underestimated the courage of a small girl and her golden-furred guardian. The courtroom erupted into conversation as people began to exit. Mr. made his way over to Emma, moving slowly with the aid of his cane. When he reached her, he lowered himself carefully to one knee so he could look her in the eyes. Thank you, young lady, he said, his voice thick with emotion. You gave an old soldier back his peace of mind, and you made sure my buddy's medals, his voice broke slightly, that they came home where they belong. Emma threw her arms around his neck, hugging him tightly. I'm so glad they found your things, mister. I was so scared for you. You were scared for me, Mr. laughed through his tears. Sweetheart, you're the bravest person I know, braver than half the soldiers I served with, and that's saying something. Bailey, always knowing when his presence would help, moved closer and placed his head on Mr.'s knee. The elderly veteran's hand dropped automatically to stroke the dog's soft fur. And you, sir, he said to Bailey, are a true American hero. Over the next hour, the courtroom slowly emptied, but Emma found herself surrounded by people wanting to thank her, congratulate her, take photos with her and Bailey. The local news crews outside got their footage. Emma standing on the courthouse steps with Bailey, both of them squinting slightly in the bright morning sun, both of them radiating quiet confidence and joy. Doctor gave multiple interviews, explaining the science behind therapy dog interventions, the training required, the potential applications in various settings. She fielded calls from courts in 3 different states before she even left the courthouse, all of them interested in implementing similar programs. Ms. announced to the press that the District Attorney's Office would be establishing a Victim Services Therapy Dog program, with Bailey and Doctor as the founding team. The announcement was met with enthusiastic applause from the gathered crowd. But perhaps the most significant moment came that evening, back at Emma's small house on Maple Street. Emma sat in her backyard, Bailey's head resting in her lap as the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink. Her mother was inside making Emma's favorite dinner, arroz con pollo, to celebrate. Her little brother Carlos was playing with his toy trucks nearby, making engine noises. Emma looked down at Bailey and whispered, I'm not scared of the dark anymore. Isn't that weird? Yesterday I was terrified and today, I'm not. Bailey's tail thumped against the grass. Emma smiled and continued, Doctor says that facing our fears makes them smaller. She says you helped me do that. But I think you did more than that, Bailey. You showed me that I'm stronger than I thought I was. You helped me find my brave. As if in response, Bailey rolled over onto his back, his tongue lolling out in a goofy grin, asking for belly rubs. Emma laughed, a genuine, joyful laugh that her mother heard through the open kitchen window and had to pause cooking to wipe away tears of happiness. 6 months later, Emma and Bailey were invited to the state capitol for the official signing of what had become known as Emma's Law legislation, allowing certified therapy animals in courtrooms throughout the state. Emma wore a new dress for the occasion, and Bailey wore a special ceremonial collar. The governor praised their courage and signed the bill into law while cameras flashed and politicians applauded. But for Emma, the real victory had already happened. In a courtroom, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when she'd found the courage to speak her truth with her best friend by her side. Bailey never knew he was a hero. He just knew he loved Emma and that helping her made his tail wag. And really, that was all that mattered. As the years passed, Emma would sometimes tell the story of that day in court. She'd tell it to her classmates, to groups of trauma survivors, eventually to her own children. And every time she'd end it the same way. Bailey didn't make me brave. He just helped me realize I was brave all along. And that's what true friends do. They don't change who you are. They help you become who you were always meant to be. And Bailey, who lived a long and happy life full of important work and belly rubs and treats, would have agreed, if only dogs could talk. But maybe, in the ways that mattered most, he already had. The end.